While I've been agonizing over the wait for the Elden Ring DLC, I've been passing the time lately by looking back at Fromsoft's past Souls games. Elden Ring is definitely still my favorite in my opinion, but I will also fully admit that I never actually played Bloodborne. If only there was some kind of PC port or remake that I could play, but I digress. The design of the Souls games as a whole is an interesting case study for game design, because in many ways they have a lot of design elements that many people would consider, well, problematic, to say the least. The biggest arguably being that FromSoft really seems to like the idea of kicking you while you're down. The idea that not only did you fail to overcome the challenge put in front of you, but that you are also now going to be made weaker because of that failure, and thus the challenge that you got stuck on is going to be even harder now than it was the first time. In game design terms, this is known as a positive feedback loop. Now, a lot of people get these terms confused, so allow me to clarify what I mean real quick. A positive feedback loop is essentially any kind of system that reinforces the behavior that triggered it in some way. So, for example, in League of Legends, if you're winning your lane and killing your opponent a lot, then you're going to level up faster, which makes it that much easier to keep killing your opponent thanks to the power difference, and keep leveling up even more. But in a positive feedback loop, that can also reinforce negative behavior. This is often mistakenly called a negative feedback loop, but a negative feedback loop is actually a loop that counteracts the behavior that triggered it. So, for example, the classic example of a negative loop are things like the items in Mario Kart. The closer you are to the front, the worse items that you get, while those in the back get super powerful items that let them rocket forward several places. As a result, people in the back are being pushed forwards and people in the front are being pulled backwards. The feedback loop that is the item system is actively trying to push everyone towards the middle of the pack. And to show why a positive feedback loop is still a positive loop even when it reinforces negative behavior, well, just think about my earlier example from League of Legends. From the perspective of the player that is leveling up faster, the feedback loop is reinforcing their winning behavior. But from the perspective of their enemy, the one that is dying constantly, that very same feedback loop is reinforcing their losing negative behavior. The more that they die, the more experience that they're giving to their opponent, and thus the harder it is for them to keep up, resulting in them dying more often. And that kind of design that reinforces failure is what we're mostly here to talk about today with FromSoft's catalog. So now that our terms are defined, many people say that you often want to avoid runaway feedback loops in games, but that doesn't mean that they don't have their place. To talk about League one more time, matches in that game can go on for ages, so by having a positive feedback loop that reinforces a team's winning behavior, that can at least help make the game end sooner once it becomes clear that one team is performing better than the other one, and then everyone can move on to a new fresh match that much more quickly. But FromSoft games are pretty unique in that they tend to include some kind of positive feedback loop that reinforces failure even in a single-player game, which is pretty uncommon. You usually see quite the opposite. Like how in Resident Evil 4, they have that adaptive difficulty system, where if you die a lot in the same area, the enemies will start having less health behind the scenes, and other minor subtle changes to try and make sure that the player doesn't get stuck. But FromSoft's philosophy is really more about the struggle itself. They seem to really want the player to get down to some really low lows that they have to overcome. But the way that they do this has definitely changed over time, and I think that it's in response to how people tend to react to these kinds of systems. To start with, let's take a look all the way back at Demon Souls. This is probably the most brutal version of this system that they've ever made, and given that it's the first one, that probably says a lot about how this analysis is going to go right off the bat. So, to start with, this game established some of the most fundamental punishments for dying that has mostly stayed consistent throughout the whole series. You drop your souls, which are effectively your experience points for leveling and your currency, and you get sent back to an earlier checkpoint, with the only way to get them back being to fight your way back to where you died. And this is definitely really punishing. After all, nobody likes losing their resources. But at the end of the day, the player isn't actually made mechanically weaker by losing their resources like this. Sure, it sucks to have to grind out those souls all over again, and your level up progression is slowed down as a result, but when it comes to being stuck at a particular boss or something like that, having 1,000,000 souls or 0 souls makes no real difference in how strong you are, it just makes you more reckless. It's still a positive feedback loop, as players who are worse at the game will level up more slowly, while players that are good and don't die as much can keep more of their resources and thus level up more quickly. But because it doesn't actually make you any weaker in the moment, I think that this is why the corpse running mechanic in particular has stuck around so long throughout all of these different Souls games. Hell, I think that there's an argument to be made that in some ways, losing your souls can sometimes act as a psychological buff when you're stuck at a boss. After all, if you have lots of souls when you go in, you're you're going to be playing a lot more cautiously and be worried about losing them. But once you die, and then you die again and lose them all permanently, well, then you literally have nothing else to lose, so you're free to try more offensive and risky strategies without the fear of risking anything for doing so. But that's not the only punishment for death in Demon Souls. Rather famously, or maybe I should say infamously, there is of course the humanity system and world tendency. Now, I'll fully admit that I don't actually really understand all of the ins and outs of these systems, but I'll try to explain it as best as I can from what I do understand. So, your human form is technically your default state, but given that this is a Souls game, you're likely to die, and when you die, you lose it pretty quickly and often. When you lose your human form, your health bar is cut in half compared to what it is normally, and you're unable to summon help from other players. On top of this, when you die while in your human form, the world tendency also lowers, which from what I understand, also makes the enemies tougher on top of everything else. So yeah, dying in Demon Souls can be really punishing. Now, thankfully, if you've already lost your human form and are just in your soul form when you die, it doesn't get any worse beyond that point. And there are some downsides to being in your human form as well, as that opens yourself up to invasions by other players. While I could definitely see how, if you change your mindset a bit, you might be able to deal with some of the penalties a bit better, I do think it's pretty clear why a lot of people tend to bounce off of Demon Souls. Don't get me wrong, it still has its fans and it's still sold really well, especially with the recent remake, but with how punishing the game can be when you are already struggling, it can be a real chore to get through, especially if you're not actually aware of the world tendency mechanics or the invasion systems. You could accidentally make your game way, way harder by being bad at it. And I think that some of the changes to how they handle these punishments is part of why Dark Souls ended up having such a larger cultural impact than Demon Souls. So while we're talking about it, let's see what they changed when Dark Souls came around. So like I said, the basics are still here. You lose your souls and you go back to an earlier checkpoint when you die, although it is worth pointing out right away that Dark Souls is a bit more generous with its checkpoint system. Demon Souls had some more distinct levels that weren't really connected to each other directly, and from what I understand, the only checkpoints were gotten after you beat a boss, so when you die, you kinda gotta do the whole area all over again. Meanwhile, Dark Souls has a much more interconnected level design with lots of bonfires spread throughout, so right away, the game already feels a lot less punishing. You still often have to run through a group of enemies or two before you can get back to the boss that you actually died at, but it's a far cry from having to redo entire levels again. On top of that, while there is still a humanity system that you do lose on death, it no longer reduces your health bar. It does still provide a lot of benefits, but these benefits are a lot more subtle, especially for a player that isn't fully aware of all of the game's ins and outs. It's also a little bit more fluid since you can hold multiple points of humanity without actually being human, but either way they're still lost on death. In general, your physical and elemental defense is raised the more humanity you have, making you a little bit more tanky, but in a much more subtle way than it was in Demon Souls. And there's a few other secondary benefits like your item discovery going up and certain weapon types having their damage increased alongside your humanity. Your actual human form itself is really only used for online play now, so if you want to say summon help or invade people or open yourself up to invasions and whatnot, like that's what you use your human form for. So now the online systems are basically completely divorced from the rest of the mechanics, which just gives you one less thing to worry about if you're concerned about that kind of thing. Overall, while having more humanity still definitely buffs you plenty, it definitely still stings a lot less to lose those buffs than it did to watch your health bar get cut in half. Though, speaking of that, they didn't get rid of that mechanic entirely. After all, you can still be cursed in Dark Souls, which does inflict that health bar penalty that persists after death. And of course, naturally, that tends to stand out as one of the most frustrating things that people talk about in that game. And I think that says a lot about these kinds of systems right there. The humanity system is already a fairly impactful system. It makes you more durable and you collect humanity passively over time by just killing lots of enemies as well as bosses and whatnot. So it's arguably much more prevalent than the human form in Demon Souls, which you could mostly just choose to ignore if you wanted. Yet people seem to be far more accepting of the idea of losing their humanity in Dark Souls, at least from what I can find of people talking about it online when browsing ancient internet forums. I mean, to be clear, we are still ultimately comparing two systems that both cause an immense amount of rage and frustration in most people, but in Demon Souls, many people are so disheartened by their loss that they don't want to continue, while in Dark Souls, people seem to want to push through true despite it. I mean, I still remember when I first played Dark Souls back in the day with zero real knowledge about the series. I still got the general vibe that the game wanted to push me forwards towards success no matter how hard it beat me down. And I do think that the more overt visual component of losing your health in Demon Souls really does take a bigger toll mentally on the player than the actual mechanical difficulty that it imposes. Like, even if you got enough humanity in Dark Souls to have so much extra defense that it was roughly equivalent in how much more durable it made you, I still feel like losing your humanity wouldn't feel as bad as it would in Demon Souls when you visually just see that health bar shrink on the UI. Sure, the fact that you're sent back further with less generous checkpoints is definitely another large factor, but I do think that in many ways this falls prey to the same psychology. After all, anytime you die in these games, it's only because you were able to get at least that far the first time around, and you're probably even better at tackling the enemies on future attempts since you know where they are. But the visual of seeing yourself all the way back at the beginning is definitely going to deal psychic damage every time it happens. But of course, that's not the only way that FromSoft has warped the psychology of punishing failure throughout these games. If we jump ahead to Dark Souls 3, they do another thing that is common in game design, which is to reframe a nerf as a buff. Rather famously, there's this classic example of game design from World of Warcraft, where the developers at the time were trying to find a way to get people to literally stop playing their game because they kept playing it for like 20 hours straight. Their first thought was to put in place some kind of exhaustion system, where the amount of experience that you would get over the course of a single play session would decrease over time. The idea being that once your progression slowed down enough, you would be incentivized to, like, sleep or shower for a change, and then when you logged in the next day, it would reset back to your full progression. But naturally, people hated this, because, well, people just don't like being punished with nerfs and such, especially for just playing the game. So they went back to the drawing board to try and come up with an alternate solution. But that's the thing, they didn't actually come up with a different solution, mechanically speaking. All they did was reframe the solution that they already had in a more palatable way. Instead of making it a penalty, now you got a temporary daily login bonus that doubled your experience progression for a couple hours before gradually going back down to normal, and in turn they also doubled the amount of experience that everything in the game takes. So mechanically, it was literally exactly the same as the first solution, but now instead of displaying your experience progression as going from 100% to 50%, it displayed it as going from 200% to 100%, and basically everyone ate it up with virtually no complaints. And I think that FromSoft has done a very similar thing with how the punishment system in Dark Souls 3 works. Now the system revolves around whether you're embered or not in place of humanity, but the game much more explicitly puts you in a non-embered state at the start. And on top of that, where previously you would start out looking normal and then slowly decay into a more undead-looking corpse as you died, now in Dark Souls 3 you look human when you're depowered, and then you start glowing with fiery embers when you're, well, embered, which really makes it feel more like a powered-up state. And of course, even the item description itself for embers describes its effect as boosting your maximum HP until death, rather than framing it as losing your maximum HP when you die until you use this item to recover it. Ultimately, the system is actually way closer in design to Demon Souls' original base punishment system than Dark Souls 1 was. At the end of the day, when you lose your embered state, your maximum HP is reduced and online play is disabled, but because they went out of their way to try and frame it as a buff when you're embered instead of a nerf for when you're not, I think that a lot more people were more accepting of this change. And to take it a step further, I think you could even say that Elden Ring has a system that is somewhat of an extension of this. It's not really classified as a specific state per se, like the Embered state, but when you consume a rune arc to empower a great rune, you enter a very similar kind of state as you would when you have humanity or embers in these older games, and you have a semi-permanent buff that lasts until you die. The key difference, of course, being that now you have multiple great runes to choose from as you progress, and it also takes a lot longer for most people to find their first great rune than it does for most people to first enter the embered state in a game like Dark Souls 3. And as a result, I think that this has caused them to basically go all the way into turning the system into strictly being about buffs. After all, thanks to the more open world nature of the game, you could easily go well over a dozen hours or more before you finally beat Godric for the first time, which means that you're spending a very, very long time in your quote unquote nerfed state, which more than any other game we've talked about so far in this series makes it feel much more like your proper default state, with your Great Rune empowered form just being a temporary buff, even though it still lasts until death, just like your Humanity or Embers would in previous Souls games, because people are forced to get used to their base form for so long. There are definitely still some players that like to pop a rune arc basically every time they respawn, especially if they're doing something like using Godric's rune to meet weapon requirements, and that in turn does make the system feel more like the classic Humanity system. But there are also many more players who essentially all but ignore the Great Rune system entirely, maybe only popping a rune arc when they're actively struggling with a boss because they want the temporary buff. So while this does feel like a pretty natural evolution of these systems in these Souls games, it does feel like they've reached the logical extreme of just turning a system that was once about punishing the player into a system about buffing the player. And to be fair, it's not like I'm saying that's necessarily a bad thing. After all, Elden Ring is their most popular game by far, with it rapidly approaching on surpassing the entire trilogy of Dark Souls games in sales. And maybe part of that is because players feel more empowered by the way the game's mechanics are framed, whereas in older games they might feel like the game is kicking them while they're down. But it does make me wonder if maybe they might try to pull it back in some way for a future game, similar to how in Dark Souls 3 they brought back some mechanics that were more reminiscent of Demon Souls while framing it in a more modern lens to make it feel more palatable. Like, maybe if something like the Great Rune system was remade for a future game, but maybe it could have you start with at least a basic Great Rune instead of nothing at the beginning of the game. That way you could interact with the Great Rune system from the start of the game instead of having to wait potentially dozens or more long hours before you beat the first world boss. That way your depowered state is not necessarily your default state anymore, because you can always empower yourself with a Great Rune. Maybe something like that would strike a good balance between feeling like a system of buffs rather than nerfs, while still making you feel some of the pain that FromSoft likes to revel in from losing those buffs on death. But regardless, looking back over their catalog as a whole, while yes, I did obviously skip over a few games, it does seem pretty clear to me that overall the trend that they've been working towards is trying to make punishing their players feel at least more palatable with each new entry. Though, of course, there are also some arguments that they have toned down some of the punishments themselves as well. However, I do think that these psychological tricks and how you frame your mechanics is an important lesson to learn from these sorts of games, and it could easily allow them to start ramping things back up again in future games if they wanted to, as long as they continue to employ these tricks. And I think that we're all eager to see what FromSoft does next, and maybe when they make their next game after Elden Ring, you can look and see how they framed their punishment mechanics and maybe learn a thing or two. But as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What's your history with FromSoft's catalog? Do you think that they've gone soft with their more recent games, or do you think that there's merit to this idea that how you frame your mechanics can have a dramatic effect on how they're received? And if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like, and if you want to see me make more videos of this, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make more videos in the future. If you really want to help the channel out, then you can become a member on YouTube, or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.